Hello, everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, an IRI company. IRI helps organizations navigate workplace challenges, improve employee engagement and productivity, manage labor relations, and implement effective communication strategies to achieve their goals. For more information, you can visit Projections online at projectionsinc.com. I am Jennifer Oraquah, Director of Business Development for IRI, and your host for this week's episode of Project HR. For decades, burnout was treated as a personal problem, something that happened to people who weren't able to handle stress or who'd taken on more work than they really should have. But that changed in 2019 when burnout was officially recognized by the World Health Organization as an occupational phenomenon. And in the last 18 months, of course, burnout has been taken to a whole other level as we all collectively try to balance our work lives as well as our home lives throughout the pandemic. That's why I'm thrilled to be talking today with Jennifer Moss. Jen is an award-winning journalist, a syndicated radio columnist on well-being for Radio Canada, and author who has recently been focusing on all that stress and the effect it's having on us. Jen's latest book is The Burnout Epidemic, The Rise of Chronic Stress and How We Can Fix It. Jen, welcome to Project HR.
Thanks for having me.
So Jen, let's start with a basic question. When we say burnout, what do we mean? What kinds of behaviors are we talking about?
Well, you mentioned in 2019 that the World Health Organization actually identified it as a chronic stress left unmanaged is really how they defined it. But when they included it in their international classification of diseases, their IDC-11, it really prompted organizations to reconsider how they were managing and treating and handling burnout because the accountability sort of started to shift towards more employers having responsibility for it. When you really look at what it means and the fact that it's an occupational phenomena, we no longer have to imagine that burnout is something that exists in life in the same way that we have been for so long. Really, it's a workplace systemic issue that comes out of policy or bad policy, really bad corporate hygiene, and
Mhm.
just not really looking at chronic stress upstream.
So what are some of the consequences for burning out on an individual level, say for our employees?
There's serious consequences. I mean, when you look at just the healthcare costs alone, there was one study by the American Psychological Association that found in high pressure firms, healthcare costs are around 50% greater than other organizations. Workplace stress is estimated to cost the US economy more than $500 billion. I mean, it's astronomical, and people just tend to take more sick days. We're also seeing this mass resignation right now. There's high levels of attrition that are
Mm-hmm.
scaring organizations. And a big part of that is because people are saying, my well being matters. When you have a year facing or longer where you face your
Mm-hmm.
own mortality, it
Mm-hmm.
becomes consequential how you're going to exist at work.
And we talked about this shift in thinking from burnout as an individual problem to a systemic one. Why is it so important for that shift to happen?
Well, and that's why a lot of us, researching burnout, were sort of, shouting from the rooftops, this is a problem. And then in 2019, when it was addressed by the WHO, we felt a bit of relief. But it didn't, that definition didn't go so far to say, it's still not on you, individual, to solve your own
Mm,
burnout. And the thing is that the way that we're treating it, sort of with self-care, isn't the answer, because it is something that happens so much further upstream. It happens, in just levels of workload, overwork. Chronic overwork has a big impact on people. The fact that people aren't feeling like they have agency over their choices, the discrimination, systemic discrimination,
mhm,
some of these
mhm.
really big issues, even just equity and pay. That's stuff that can't be solved with yoga and breathing,
Right.
and in technology that's supposed to help us meditate. That's great for optimization, but it's not going to actively solve for burnout.
So I'm thinking that none of that worked. The yoga, the learning to say no, don't answer emails at home, none of that worked because we weren't addressing the real problem.
Exactly. I mean, you've got it right. It's a downstream tactic, and when you really look at our goal, really as leaders and in organizations, we should be preventing people from falling in, not dragging them out as they, are drowning downstream. And so, a lot of these really great optimization strategies, and again, they're very important. We need to still have, an ecosystem approach. So, downstream tactics like proactively helping people to optimize and motivate through yoga, through these perks.
Mm,
But if you're really going to solve for burnout, it has to happen again where you're looking at prevention strategies. So all those two things have to be available, but they have to be not just considered under an entire wellness program. A burnout prevention strategy and a wellness strategy are two different things.
Okay. So I'm thinking that the lack of success of those individual efforts, like, go do yoga, putting it on the individual really just kind of has added to the stress. What do you think?
It does. It increases shame for not feeling the way that we should be feeling. One of the byproducts or the symptoms of burnout is this sense of shame, especially for high performing people that are, potentially maybe more prone to perfectionist concerns, which is something that is attributed to burnout. We
Mhm.
have these people that feel this negative self talk for not being able to hit those goals or,
Mm,
hit those metrics. And yet, if the metrics are just impossible to reach, or the unsustainable workload is leading to you not being able to be able to reach those personal and individual goals, then you're going to constantly feel like you're less than. And then we tend to overgeneralize, and we tend to think, okay, well, then I'm just not good at this job, or I'm not meant to be in this job.
mm,
I'm bad at this job.
mm.
And all of those things, just the impact on our mental health is quite catastrophic. And when we all bundle those things together, we're just going to create a recipe for burnout.
Yeah, sure. So let's go a little bit deeper. What causes burnout in our organizations?
Well, there are six root causes, and I mentioned one. Workload is one.
Hmm.
We also see that in fairness, so lack of fairness. So that could be in our diversity inclusion. We see
Mm,
that when there's a lack of agency. So if we're micromanaged, we've seen this increase in stuff like bossware and tattleware, where people are starting to monitor their people, which is really increasing burnout. We see that in our lack of community. So the loneliness and isolation piece has really increased. Sort of that mismatched skills really
mhm,
does also impact us. So the fact that maybe in our organization, the only way to get promoted is to be a people leader. But what if you're just better as an individual contributor? And so we continue to promote people thinking that they should move up in this hierarchical system that we have created for them, but really maybe that's not what they're good at. So how do we
mm,
promote those people?
mhm,
And then just chronic, overqualification. We're seeing that in our younger generation right now, millennial workers or Gen Zs that are have just gone through an economic crisis where they had to go back to school to get their skills updated to be competitive. And then what happens is another economic crisis happens, and now they're in a path to being overqualified for long periods of time. So you have these root causes of burnout that are really pretty, it's pretty macro. And we
mhm,
need to be looking at the fact that they are both societal. They're also, inside of organizations at the top levels when it comes to
mhm.
policy and infrastructure. But we can solve for them in micro-targeted way. But understanding that they're a very complex, sort of large problem to solve helps us to be able to understand that it's certainly not, on an individual to solve those problems themselves.
And that makes perfect sense. So we've talked about the consequences for individuals and we've talked about the root causes. How does burnout impact our companies? What are the consequences if we allow a burnout culture to remain in our workplace?
Well, you're really seeing it now I think, the first time in history where you're seeing employees sort of having that control or agency to choose, and attrition is so high.
Mm, mhm,
One of the Microsoft surveys that looked at about 30,000 global employees, and they said about 41% are looking at actively leaving their career entirely or
oh, wow.
leaving their jobs come this fall. I mean,
Mm,
when you look at that stat, and you see this across national, data as well,
mhm,
just in
mhm,
general, people are looking at leaving their jobs because they do not want to go back to an environment that doesn't care about their well-being. In the research data that I was able to do with Dr. Christina Maslach, Dr. Michael Leiter, who are foremost experts in burnout, and then Dr. David Whiteside, who's also a leader in organizational behavior, we looked at just well-being during the pandemic, and we found that of those people that can't talk about mental health at work, 67% of them felt burnout extremely often. So,
mm,
just in general, right now, people are saying, I need to be able to have this openness at work. I need to be able to deal with my mental health. I need well-being to be the most important part of my workplace, or else I'm leaving. And that's sort of changing. I think there's a paradigm shift that's happening right now. Workplaces are having, to contend with that and make changes to adjust.
Yeah, I think in addition to the many myriad of things that we've had to add to our plates as HR practitioners, this is just another one that we definitely have to address.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. Again, it's, and it's an HR responsibility. It's a leadership responsibility.
Mhm.
Employees still have to come to work, with without learned helplessness. They have to be able to have psychological
Mhm.
fitness, and then we need to have really big, thoughts around, major policy decisions, paternity leave, maternity leave, family
Mhm.
pay. The government has to get involved in the family paid leave. I mean, these are all things that require a huge sort of a desire
Mhm.
to make change. Or, here we go through a pandemic that I think created this need to rethink how we've
Mhm.
been managing burnout for so long.
Mhm. All right, Jen, I need to take a quick sponsorship break right now, but when we return, I want to talk about how we can address burnout in our own organizations. So stay with us.
Thanks to this week's Project HR sponsor, LaborWise Leadership. LaborWise Leadership provides your frontline leaders with the knowledge they need to help you avoid third-party interference in your business. With this powerful online course, you'll teach your leaders how to create greater engagement while remaining union-free. Get your free trial at projectionsinc.com/laborwise.
And I'm back here on Project HR with Jennifer Moss, award-winning journalist, syndicated radio columnist, and author of The Burnout Epidemic: The Rise of Chronic Stress and How We Can Fix It. So, Jen, how do we know if our workplace maintains that burnout culture that I referenced? Are there signs we should be looking for?
Yeah, we're seeing them right now as certain organizations are saying, you know what, I know we just went through 20 months of completely, changing our neural wiring and creating new habits. And, I know that everything has changed in the last 20 months, but I'm going to jam the toothpaste back in the tube here and try to and try to
Right,
go back to,
right.
to work as I once know it, because that's just what I know, and I don't really want to change the way that I'm thinking. And that kind of leadership is, is really demonstrating that they've missed, they're sort of yeah, missing the point.
Mm,
And I think that when we see that and you're seeing this revolt and people leaving, that's demonstrating that people aren't in agreement. We also see things, like really good intentions of firms coming up with this plan to have, a week off, to help their burned
mhm,
out employees be able to recover. And I really think that they're getting that wrong. It's not that we're supposed to give a week off to employees after they're burned out. We should be,
mhm,
again, thinking what is causing them to burn out. A lot of employees are coming back to work saying, it was great for a couple days, but the same workload exists. I
mhm.
have now so much more to catch up on. So we need to
Right.
be able to make goals flexible. We need to be able to really look at, why are we celebrating that we're giving a week off to our burned out employees? That just says it all to me. There's so much irony in that statement. It should be that we're going to reconsider what is the expectation of what time you have to check in, how many hours you're working a week. Do you get time for self care? Do you take your lunch at your desk? Celebrating people taking time off, modeling the behavior as managers, where every time I take a 20-minute break, I let my whole team know and encourage them to take one too. I mean, there's many tactics that I can, that I can describe, but really it is about, again, not downstream solutions, but upstream strategies to help people from burning out in the first place.
So let's say that I do recognize signs of burnout in my workplace. Can traditional corporate wellness efforts, the things we've talked about here on Project HR before, like gym memberships, meditation apps, those sort of things, can those be of any help?
They can, in that, there are people that are flourishing, they're thriving, and they're doing really well. And we want to get more people to the point where they're at that neutral stage so that they can be optimized. We have about 20% of people in general that are, high performing, engaged, happy at work. And so those people really do benefit from those other parts of, those wellness programs that optimize, that give us that boost. And then if we have, at the same time, people supporting those folks that are dealing with mental illness or chronic stress or burnout. So there's strategies again on the other side that are sort of propping more people up into that neutral place so that we can then provide them those tools to optimize. Then that will be, that will be an ideal situation. So you need to have both, and one shouldn't replace the other. Just they come at different times in an employee's experience and level of happiness and wellness inside of
Mm-hmm.
their, workplace experience.
So if we do see signs, we've talked a little bit here about, being proactive and getting ahead of this, but if that horse has already left the barn, how do we go about fixing it?
That's a really, great question. There's a lot of, strategies, and I mentioned a lot of them in the book, but a big part of it is just, using this concept that, and I've been really touting it, as the idea of empathy at work, and this goal to actively listen. So instead of using the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, but do unto others, and this is golden rule 2.0, but do unto others as they would do unto themselves. So, instead of creating policies, infrastructure, strategy, communication, plans or platforms based in the image, or sort of developed in the image of us, we should be
Mm-hmm.
developing it in the image of the people we serve. So,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes a lot of, database decision making. It's direct managers checking in frequently with people every single week about non-work related, topics, making sure that you're getting to the semiotics, and looking behind what people are saying. We say we're fine around, 14 times a week, and yet we only mean it about 19% of the time. So, we're lying to people about how okay we are. We need people to dig deeper. We need to have people ask, are you really fine? And again, it's just in those very small pieces of data, the management by walking around, that you end up getting to the clues that lead you to then be able to, create empathetic policies that serve more people and serve people in the way that they really do need to be supported. And that really can be a game changer in lots of organizations.
So let's talk about what an anti burnout strategy is. How can we build one in our workplaces?
Well, first, again, that the measurement is really important. We want to be able to measure for burnout and find out exactly how people are feeling. We do that in a variety of different ways. But making sure that we have anonymous ways of getting feedback from people, and that
Mm-hmm.
there's a feedback loop that's anonymous, is really important, because a lot of people believe that there's systemic discrimination when it comes to stigma around mental health. So that's really important. And once we kind of get a litmus test of how people are feeling, often there's a big delta between leaders and how they think of the level of thriving in their organizations versus how people are actually experiencing work. So we need to, to kind of shorten or close that delta, close that gap. And
Mm-hmm.
once we have a lot of that data sort of figured out, then we can start attacking problems where they really exist. And in lots of organizations, it's not a one size fits all. It's certain groups have different experiences. I did a lot of research and came to understand that those working in software development have different needs than those working in high production sales environments. And
Mm-hmm.
so, what we need to do is figure out where people are burning out and how they're burning out, and then be able to tackle them, where they are. Again, that empathetic leadership, and then figuring out what are the micro strategies within different groups so that we can then, execute on some of these interventions.
So we don't really have to wait for a problem before implementing this kind of a strategy, do we?
The whole point again is upstream. I talk about this really great, there's a couple really great tactics that are so easy to implement. One of them is just checking in. The more we check in, the more likely we are to be able to diagnose problems before they actually happen. It's unbelievable how few times, boss and their team get together to actually just talk about non-work related topics. It should be 15 minutes a week, and we should be asking, everyone, what were some of the barriers to reaching your goals? And, what were those stresses? Were they personal, professional? Let's create
Mm,
a very safe environment to talk about them, because we want to create those workplaces of trust. And trust takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a
mhm.
sort of, 5 year to life, development of really
Sure.
healthy cultures, right?
Mhm, mhm,
And so you have to do that as a continuum. And then, this one question can be so helpful. And that's, what can we do for each other as a team to make next week easier? So then it's peers that are helping peers. And we find collaborative work environments and collaborative goals to be a big reducer of burnout. And then me as your boss, what can I do to make next week just a little bit easier? And often they're the simple things that need to be solved. They're the bit by bit, slow micro changes, kind of like how in neuroplasticity our brain changes based on, the environment that we live in. That's how cultures change. Is just slowly, but surely, consistent behavior. And every
mhm.
little change, it happens week to week, and over time then we see the results.
And all of this makes perfect sense. It's just a matter of being thoughtful about it and making sure that we're implementing it. What role does leadership play in building, implementing, or supporting this kind of an anti-burnout strategy?
Well, leaders really need to model the behavior. I mean, we all know sort of the concept of you can't be what you can't see. Well, if employers or leaders, high level, senior executives are saying, "I want you to do this, but I'm not taking the time off," or "I'm answering emails
Mhm,
on weekends and evenings," or "I'm, not taking the time off that I need to
mhm.
reset." All of those behaviors, again, we know it, but it just is very difficult for people in these roles to actually execute. And so it needs to be a paradigm shift where you're really making this effort and understanding that nothing will change unless it's actually happening in this sort of crowdsourced way. People need to see it, then it needs to go on for some time that is trusted. It can't just be a program that, we have this check-in meeting for 6 months and then it
Mhm,
dies off. It
mhm.
really has to be this consistent effort, because it's easier to start these problems than it is to continue them and make them
Sure.
part of the DNA. And I
Yeah.
think that's what we're seeing through the pandemic, is that there was just this mindset of business as usual, and not really understanding that, after 20 months we're no longer in an emergency. By definition, emergencies are unexpected. This is
Mhm,
not unexpected anymore, but we haven't really created sort of, well, what if this is going to be like this for 2 years? Shouldn't we
mhm.
have a plan and action that sort of takes this as its own unique time and behave accordingly? And that means, maybe we have to change the goals. Maybe it isn't the same revenue goals or the metrics of growth.
Mhm.
Maybe we have to think about how we actually continue to grow in 2 or 3 years from now, when everyone is just so depleted because we tried to actually have this high level of growth mode in the middle of a global pandemic.
Right, right.
And so maybe that's not the time to grow. And we have a hard time thinking like that, as we have shareholder expectations, and we have, leaders that have, expectations on them to hit these targets. But if we want to actually stay a company in 2 years from now with a staff that's actually going to be able to work at the productivity levels and be engaged, like
Mhm,
you want them to be, gonna this is not going to happen. We're going to
mhm.
become obsolete because people are just going to be so exhausted that they won't be able to achieve those goals.
Yeah, it's just not sustainable. All right, Jen, I need to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the weekly Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and my guest today is Jennifer Moss, award-winning journalist, syndicated radio columnist, and author of The Burnout Epidemic: The Rise of Chronic Stress and How We Can Fix It. And we're back. So once we get the strategy in place, how do we know it's working? Is there a way to measure success?
Yes, definitely. We have a really great tool, the Maslow Burnout Inventory. It's sort of the gold standard. It also is paired with the Areas of Work Life Survey. And what it does is it allows you to see where are people in the sort of the level of burnout. Is it early stage burnout we're seeing in some groups, or are we starting to get to a point where people are feeling pretty cynical? And this is where you start to see more attrition. So, you measure those. That's really important. But direct managers do have this capacity to see where they're team is. And I think lately what I've seen from a lot of leaders is that they are completely exhausted, they're finding that their people are tired too, that they're having a hard time motivating them. I've been doing this talk, exhausted leaders leading exhausted teams, and
Hmm.
it's quite popular, I think, because we're not just going through this where you have sort of, certain people in their sort of protected space and they're not feeling any of the impacts of this issue right now, but because it's such a macro external problem that we're dealing with sort of pervasively every day, they're feeling the same things. Plus, they're dealing with that juggling effect of, having to be parents that are, managing their children's school on top
Hmm.
of having to lead these really high performing teams. So everyone's feeling it. And I think that we can get it just through the conversations that we're having. But it's also really important to just see where we're at and then run interventions and then be able to see, okay, is this intervention that I'm working on right now actually working, and then be able to measure again. And you know what, the benefit too of pulse surveys and some of these other surveys that a lot of people have adopted, it's not a new thing. There can be ways that we can ask questions that are specific to burnout in those pulse surveys, and it could be just 5 questions once a month, but it can determine how exhausted people are, how much they're feeling like they're taking on, what their workload feels like, and if they are becoming cynical, which is that sort of that final symptom of burnout where you start to feel a level of hopelessness. And
Mm.
that's when you can really dive into supporting people on the ground.
So if we get these strategies into place and we're in a sort of in a proactive mode, are there any key behaviors that leaders need to encourage to help provide a slide back into that burnout behavior?
Yeah, I mean, like, and I keep repeating this in all my articles about empathy and leadership, but empathy and leadership and trust are so important. And I think the trust comes from consistency. And so, even in the middle of, a global pandemic, I was able to interview some folks for the book at HPE, Hewlett Packard, the chief
Mhm.
people officer there. And what Alan May was saying was that he just made it so that he could bubble up ideas, made social collaboration tools and platforms open to anyone who wanted to talk about anything. There was no proctoring, there was no expectation that it had to be work related. It's all about trying to see and listening, actively listening about what people are feeling, and then bubbling up the ideas that really are going to, continue to work. So not being married to your ideas or concepts or ways of working before the pandemic is going to be really critical. Agile leadership, I think, is the most important type of leadership right now, because part of what we've gone through in the last 20 months is learning how to pivot and be emotionally flexible.
Mhm.
So if we're asking our employees to pivot and be flexible and be able to move and make changes and work in different, in different ways, and then saying, okay, well, we just want to go back to how it was. Well, we're losing all of those skills and the capacity that we just built into our workforce. And so when we're talking about leading through change now in the future, we've developed these skills whether we realize it or not. The pandemic has developed this area of psychological fitness that is going to be really, going to prove out to be, fantastic for our workforce in the future. That means we can't hold that back. That means we
Mhm.
have to behave in accordance with that. And leaders really need to be as agile as possible to support more of this way of thinking about stress in the future. That we can handle it because we now have a frame of reference from the
Mhm.
pandemic.
Well, and of course, at Projections and IRI, we encourage our clients to do a lot of communication. So, what role does communication play in maintaining this burnout free culture that we're talking about creating?
It's hugely significant. And when I, looked into the research around the organizations that were really faring well during the pandemic, the ones where they had high employee experience survey scores, were the ones that just provided a lot of communication, but also a lot of listening. So, one example, it was, I'm going to share every day what we know, but I'm only going to spend as the CEO 15 minutes on what I know and then take an hour of questions.
Mm.
Over communication, but not in a way that it's just about it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. And I
Mhm.
think that's what we really need to gain from the pandemic and in communication strategies. Feedback is really important. And in organizations that don't have very good, feedback
Mhm.
cycles,
Mhm.
it's just it's the death to that
Yeah.
team or that company. So
Yeah.
having, really great ways of proctoring feedback. And that's where, when we talk about social collaboration platforms, when they're being monitored or proctored, or you're not supposed to talk about anything, other than work stuff on there, we're missing out the opportunity of actually creating a feedback cycle by just listening and seeing, what people are bubbling up. And that's the kind of thing that we need to start doing. Less, focusing on monitoring people, but more on listening to what they really need from us. And that communication cycle and learning how to find ways of getting feedback in maybe ways that we hadn't thought about before, that's
Hmm.
going to be what creates a more competitive company, because they know to listen in all the different places. They can read between the lines. They know the gray area of their organization, and it's just going to make them so much more successful.
Hmm. Now, Jen, throughout this discussion, we mentioned that you're a journalist, and that's actually how we first got in touch with you, through an article you wrote for the Harvard Business Review. Where else might our listeners have read your words or heard your voice?
Well, you can find me in, American Management Association. I write a lot for SHRM. I'm also in HuffPost and some of these other, onlines. I'm
Hmm.
writing right now for the Wall Street Journal. I mean, you pretty much can find me everywhere. I think in print these days,
Hmm.
sort of freelance everywhere. I think one of the sort of the areas that I've been really focusing on too are in journals like Sage and JAMA. I've
Mm.
been writing sort of more focused academic journal writing, because I think it's important. I'm a big fan of bridging the evidence and the data and the research into the practice, and I
Hmm.
think that's what a lot of organizations they benefit from, seeing that we can apply this, but also that there's so much data and academic research that's decades old that is backing up what we're doing,
Hmm.
so that you feel like this is a worthwhile investment of my time and money.
And you're also a syndicated radio columnist on well-being. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I do a weekly radio column for the Canadian Broadcasting System, and I love it because I'm a huge fan. It would be like NPR in the U.S., and
Hmm.
sometimes it
Hmm.
does trickle over into the U.S. But every week I go on and I talk to to listeners about just various well-being and wellness concepts, burnout, workplace, but it's also in life, and just how we're dealing. A lot of it is how we're dealing right now just as human beings throughout
Hmm.
this 20-month social
Yeah.
global experiment. And it's amazing how all of us are feeling so universally the same. I think,
Hmm.
in the end, that collective experience is going to make us more able to understand each other. Sometimes I think a lot of people are feeling like it's polarizing, but I also do think that we are able to empathize, and it's created this parity in leaders and their employees, so that we can
Hmm.
understand each other a little bit more as we go into the recovery post COVID world of work.
As we hope we get there, right?
Yes,
To that
I'm
recovery
a
post COVID period,
cautious optimist. Yeah.
right? All right. So tell me, where can our listeners go to learn more about you, your radio work, your books?
Mostly the best place to find me is at my website, jennifer-moss.com. And, I'm on LinkedIn a lot. I put a lot of content out there and share a lot of the writings and the work that I'm doing, and the
Mhm.
lead up to the book, which is coming out soon. It's been, an interesting role to play, a burnout expert writing a book on burnout in the middle of a global pandemic. I mean, the
Right.
irony is
Yeah.
quite
So
outstanding.
little little
But
little meta there.
it's
Yeah.
it's quite meta. Yeah, it's quite meta.
Yes.
But I think what I think it's added to the writing or the richness to the book, or even just in the content, is, I'm feeling it all too. And as much as you have these tools that I use, I try to do the best to walk the talk, that there's so much coming at us. And so every day is just an exercise in reminding myself that there's no right way to feel right now.
And just a reminder to everyone listening that we have done all the hard work for you. We've listened back to this episode and taken fantastic notes. And a link to buy Jennifer's book, The Burnout Epidemic, will be included in this episode's companion guide. So be sure to unlock that today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. All right, Jen, it is time for the Project HR lightning round. These are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So our first question is a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about burnout. So in your opinion, Jen, which of these firewood types burns best, pine or oak?
Pine.
All right.
Is that
Definitely,
right?
definitely. Is there a right answer? I don't know. That one, I know that one would smell the best. So there you go.
Yeah, right.
All
That's what I
right.
was thinking.
Second question. What is the best book that you've read recently?
Oh, I've just read A Little Life, and it is absolutely incredible. It was heartbreaking. I had to take in the middle, about page 450, I had to take a break and read a light beach read. But then I went back like in the middle of it because it was so devastating. But then I finished reading it and it's stuck with me. It's unforgettable.
All right. What's your favorite thing about the work that you do?
That it feels like there's meaning behind it, that I have passion, but that it's meaningful. I feel very connected to this topic. I've gone through burnout myself as a, founder of a tech startup and a woman in that field. And, so I care a lot about it. And so every time I have a conversation with someone and they tell me that it impacted them in some way, I feel like it's worth all the effort and strain and work, and sometimes burnout myself.
For sure. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
The best piece of advice I've been given, there's so many, but one of my favorites is you can have anything, but not everything. And I think as someone who has to make choices consistently, as a person who is a bit of a perfectionist and high performing, I constantly want to say yes and do everything. And what I've come to realize is that, what are my priorities? What are the choices in life? And how do I make sure that my deathbed regrets aren't, I didn't send out that last email to that client at 11,
Right.
PM. That it's,
Right.
that it really is that I feel like I had a life well lived. And so that is my reminder. You can have anything, Jen, but you can't have everything.
I love that. All right. And one final question. Who or what inspires you?
Oh, gosh. I'm a big nerd for data. So I love people that spend their life focused on data and research and academics. I mean, I would nerd out over Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter before I actually got to work with them. And, the Malcolm Gladwells and the Adam Grants, the people that are really trying to make sure people understand what's living in academia and science and living by science, but telling the world in a way that's relatable. That really inspires me to try to be as relatable as I can in over top all of the technical data that I spend time sort of living and breathing.
Jennifer, I want to thank you so much for talking with me today on Project HR.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
I also want to thank our listeners. Once again, this is your reminder to grab that information-packed companion guide for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. And to make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, we hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or give us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. And last but certainly not least, we're always looking for great human resources and labor relations voices on Project HR. If you'd like to be on Project HR, or if there's someone you think we should interview, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.